Hi and welcome to the From Scratch Body. I'm Liv and today we are making bread. Simple, old-fashioned yeast bread. I've got 10 tips for you on how to make perfect, flawless, faultless, chunky, chubby, tasty, chewy bread every time. You don't need a starter, you don't need loads of energy and time and commitment. You need a bit of time, but it's so easy. I promise you anyone can do this. So let's get our aprons on and let's get cooking. Tip number one is make your life easier with gluten. So you might be a bit skeptical because gluten has a bit of a bad rep and some people are obviously intolerant to gluten. Most of us who are not intolerant can handle gluten just fine. Different flours contain different amounts of gluten. So gluten is a group of proteins found in grains. So when gluten in flour starts to mix with water, it creates a network that makes a glue-like consistency. That is the dough that you're getting. And that's actually where it gets its name as well, gluten. That is what makes the bread rise. And it's also what creates that lovely chewy texture that you get in bread. So you do want a bit of gluten when you're making it at home. There are different amounts of gluten in different types of flour. The trick, in my opinion, is to try and combine using some of the ones that have the most gluten, plain flour being at the top, and some that have less because they're often the healthier ones. So plain flour, white flour, all-purpose flour, whatever you want to call it. I have a massive bag here. This is actually French flour, but it's still white, plain flour. That contains the most gluten and it makes it the easiest to make lovely, big, chunky bread with a lovely consistency. But it's the least healthy one. So you want to try and use just what you need of that flour and then mix it with other types. If you want to play it safe, you can use about half the amount of white flour and then mix other types for the rest of the flour. I usually make 2 loaves, and when I do that, I use a kilo of flour, 1,000 grams, and I've managed to push it down to about 200 grams of white flour and still get lovely fat looking bread. But I think that's kind of the edge that I'm meeting. So if you want to go between 200 to 500 grams of plain flour out of a kilo, and then you can mix in rye, wholemeal, whole grain, seeds, all sorts of stuff. If you do suspect that you are reacting to gluten, definitely keep an eye on that and be careful. However, if you haven't made bread at home, I wouldn't give up on bread just yet. Try and make your own. There are 2 reasons for that. You might be reacting to store-bought bread because sometimes they add gluten. It's because they have to make so much bread. The demand is just insane, so they don't have the time to let it rise naturally like we can do in our kitchen. So they add gluten, and that's probably not very good for us. Secondly, bread that you buy in the store usually contains preservatives, and I've talked about preservatives before. There are obviously natural preservatives that you can use, but in the shops, when you buy food that has preservatives in it, it's often chemical, not very natural ways of preserving at all, and that goes into our bodies. I don't think it's good. I used to think that bread was really bad for me, and then I started making my own, and it's night and day. I have absolutely no problem eating the bread that I make at home. So do give it a try and keep an eye on how you're feeling. So make friends with gluten, know which types of flour contain the most gluten, and try and use that. You can play it safe at first. Just go really gluten heavy with those flours that, you know, are easiest to bake with. And then you can just reduce that amount and add some of the healthier types and see, you know, what works for you basically. Tip number 2, seeds go inside the bread, not on top. So you've probably seen in bakeries, they have these lovely loaves with seeds on top and it looks so pretty. But the second you pick it up or try and put it in a bag, all the seeds just fall off. It's a waste, in my opinion. Seeds can go inside the bread. Just mix it in with the flours, mix it in with the bread when you're making it. Seeds are super tasty in bread. They're very healthy. Nuts as well. You can, roast some nuts, chop them up, put in there. When you make hazelnut milk, you get a leftover bit of hazelnut. Well, they call it pulp, but it's more like hazelnut flour, just kind of moist hazelnut flour. I really recommend putting in your bread because I did that and it was so tasty. So if you can eat nuts, I definitely recommend putting them in bread. If you put seeds in, put them inside, not on top. Before I go on to the next tip, I'm gonna just get a dough going here so that you can kind of follow me while I'm making some bread. So I'm gonna go 100 grams of plain flour. This is for one loaf, so I'm gonna do 500 grams of flour all together. So 100 grams of plain flour, about 100 grams of rye, 200 grams of wholemeal flour. Are you counting? 50 grams of flaxseed, and 50 grams of sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds. Just gonna mix that together, ready for your next tip. Tip number 3 is don't use too much yeast. It might seem counterproductive because yeast is gonna help your bread rise, but too much of it is just gonna make it keep rising until it collapses on itself. It also compromises the taste. You don't want too much yeast. It doesn't taste very nice. So don't use too much yeast. I actually just use active dry yeast. It's super easy. They come in these sachets of 7 grams each. 7 grams is perfect for 2 loaves. Like I was talking about, a kilo of flour for me, that's about 2 full teaspoons. That's more than enough for a kilo. I've got 500 grams here, so I'm going to use half of this, no more than that. If you are in a hurry and you need the bread to rise super quickly, you can add a bit more yeast, but just know that it's not the best for the taste and it's also not the best for your stomach. I also add a tiny bit of salt. Don't add too much salt either because first of all, you don't need it. It's not going to be great for the taste, but it also kind of tries to go after the yeast and kill it. I'm not a scientist, I don't know how it works. So don't use too much salt, not good for the yeast and not good for the taste. Tip number 4, use cold water. You may have been told to use warm water or lukewarm water when you're making bread. The reason for that is warm water will kickstart that gluten process. It helps it rise faster, but rising faster is not necessarily something you want unless you are in a hurry. Then you can use warm water. But I recommend that you think of making bread as a day-long affair. Start it early in the day and let it rise. So when you use cold water, it takes longer for that process to kickstart. It still happens though, it just goes slower. And that's a good thing because you want the bread to rise slowly. It works the yeast better, it tastes better. Only use warm water if you're in a hurry and try and just plan your bread making so that you don't have to rush making it. Another great thing about cold water is the water that you put in your dough cannot be too cold, but it can be too warm, meaning if the water that you put in is too hot, it can kill off the yeast, but that's never going to happen with cold water. So definitely use cold water if you have time. I also add a tiny bit of olive oil in my bread. You don't have to do that, but I love it. It's a great addition to the taste and the texture as well. Tip number 5, knead your bread. Kneading is another way of getting that gluten process going. It's not absolutely necessary. You can make bread without kneading it, but it just takes a lot longer. I love kneading the bread because it gives me a sense of the dough, how fluffy it is, how easy it is to work with, and it really does kickstart that process of the rising that you're going to go to next. This is a good chance to make sure that you're not making the dough too dry. Slightly wet dough makes lovely crispy on the outside bread, which is really nice. You do want, well, I want that. I don't know what you want, but I definitely want that. It is a bit messier. It gets kind of sticky and stuff, but I'm going to teach you how to clean up in the best way at the end. So just embrace the mess. It's a nice workout for the arms as well, so that's a bonus. I promised when I did my Magimix video recently that I was going to show you in this video me doing bread in the Magimix. So today we'll have 2 loaves. We'll have one that I kneaded by hand, and we'll have one kneaded mostly by the Magimix. So check that out. So pros and cons here, definitely, because the dough feels incredible after it's gone through the Magimix, because it's obviously a lot more powerful than you can ever be with your hands, really. It makes it really nice and soft and smooth. So I think it's a great way to start the kneading process. Just practically, it adds a bit of washing up because it then needs to still rise in a bowl. So it's just a bit more washing up. I feel like I don't really need to knead that. Don't need to knead that. Just gonna put that in a bowl. So whatever way you knead your bread, whether it's by hand or in a bread maker or in a food processor, make sure that you knead it well, or if you don't, that you leave even more time for it to rise. Which brings me to my next tip, tip number 6, let it rise. I think I've made it clear by now that bread making takes time. And this is the process that you have to be really, really patient with. In the beginning, when I was making my own bread, I often kind of felt like I'd done something wrong because I would check it after an hour and it hadn't really risen very much. And I thought, well, it should be, should be done by now. Actually, you want your bread to rise for 2-3 hours, ideally. And if you've used cold water, that is how long it's going to take, and that's a good thing. That's when you get the best tasting bread. So you want it to rise for a couple of hours or 3 hours if you can. Then you want it to prove, which is when it rises the second time in the shape that you are going to bake it in. So if you're making bread in a loaf tin, then after it rises, you put it in the loaf tin, then let it prove, or you make little bread rolls and let them prove. And you want that to go another hour or 2 hours. So this is why I say it's a whole day affair, ideally. You can put some olive oil on top of the dough, or I just put a bit of plain flour. It stops it from sticking to whatever you put on top. You can put some cling film or just a tea towel. I use linen tea towels. I have these beautiful handmade linen towels by Kingdom of Comfort. You can find them on Instagram. The great thing about linen is that it doesn't stick to the dough. So I have these couple of linen towels that I only use for my bread to cover it when it rises, and I don't use it for anything else. I know that, planning bread making for a whole day might seem like a bit much. It's not really that much work. You just make the bread. The thing that takes time is letting it rise. So that's the only thing that you have to kind of plan time for. It's not a lot of work per se, but if it kind of doesn't really fit into your schedule, remember that you can freeze bread. Once it's come out the oven and it's cooled down completely, then you can freeze it. And when you take it out, it's going to taste completely fresh. I always do this. This is why I make 2 loaves. I let them cool down, I use one straight away, and the second one I freeze, so I don't have to make bread all the time. So if you just plan well, then you're not going to have to make it last minute. You're not going to have to do any cheat codes to make it rise quickly. So you can just relax and in your own time, make some bread that gets to rise for as long as it really wants to rise. Tip number 7, bake it well. Bread needs to be baked at quite a high temperature. I bake a small loaf for 30 minutes exactly in my oven, a fan-assisted oven at 210 degrees. If you don't have a fan-assisted oven, probably a bit hotter than that, maybe 230. I can't in my head think what that is in Fahrenheit, but I'll put it on the screen. When you've put it in the oven, don't open the door to check if it's doing all right. Let it do its thing. It still needs to rise a little bit. Let the process happen. When you think it's done, take it out, knock on the top of it and the bottom, it should feel quite hard and it should sound quite hollow. That's when it's perfect, then it's done. Tip number 8, let it rest. So when you've taken it out, you're pretty sure it's done, then let it rest on a wire cooling rack. Don't put it on a chopping board or anything. It needs to be able to breathe all the way through, otherwise it gets soggy on the bottom. You need to let the air flow through all over the bread so that it can really rest and get lovely crispy on the outside. The toughest part, don't start slicing the bread before it's cooled down. I know this is hard because brand new bread straight from the oven, warm and lovely, is so tasty, and it's okay if you want to tuck into that bread. The only problem is if you're planning on putting some of that bread away for later, it's going to get dry because all of that moisture is going to escape if you start slicing it before it's cooled down. If you want to have the opportunity of slicing straight into the bread when it comes out of the oven, then maybe make bread rolls, because then you could just take the ones that you're going to eat then and slice into them and eat them warm, which is lovely. Tip number 9, clean up with cold water. You think that when you need to clean something really thoroughly, you use hot water, right? The problem with flour is that it has gluten in it, and if you use warm water, it's going to kickstart that gluten process again, which makes it glue-like. So you're just going to get glue all over your table, over your worktop. So use cold water, trust me, it's so much easier. You want to try and clean up as soon as possible, but even if you have left it for a while, cold water is going to do it. You can even take a cloth with really cold water and just lie it on top of the bits that are messy, and it's going to help really get those parts loose. And it's the same for bowls, for everything that you've used, for utensils. Clean it with cold water. Thank you for checking out my 9 so far tips on how to make perfect bread every time at home. The 10th tip is a little bonus tip, and that is 3 recipes that I've tried and tested that I'm going to share with you now. So stick around and you're going to see those on the screen in a second. But be brave, make it your own, combine the flours that you have, take into account all the things that I've said in this video. I'd love to see how it turned out for you. So if you want to share your bread with me on Instagram, I'm at the From Scratch Body, or you can comment below. Do you have any other tips on how to make perfect yeast bread? I'd love to hear it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.